Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share you some thoughts about rook endgames. What to do with rooks and what not to do. Well, let's start with the very first example. Here we go. Well, as we know, rooks are most valuable when they are on open files. Files in where there are no pawns of your own color. It doesn't matter much if you would have a bishop or a knight, for example, in front of your rook, because you easily have the mobility to move that piece out of the way when the moment is right. On the other hand, if you have a pawn of your own in front of your rook, in the middle game typically, that means that your rook is not very active. It's not on an open file. As we shall see later in this lesson, when you have a passed pawn in the endgame, on the other hand, the rook can be an important piece supporting your passed pawn so it can advance and potentially become a queen. But we'll get to that a bit later in one of the later positions. The position we see in front of us right now, white has two rooks, so does black. However, the big difference is that the white two rooks are occupying two open files. Generally speaking, when we already occupy an open file, our next goal should be to succeed in getting to the opponent's second rank. That is, if you're white, to get your rooks to the 7th rank. Well, in this position, white is in a good situation because can do that with either of the two rooks. It is somewhat better to get onto the 7th rank with the rook on the B file. Well, what is happening right now? White entered the 7th rank with one rook, where black has 3 pawns. Now, the beauty is that if the second white rook also succeeds in arriving to c7, then white will indeed attack the pawn on g7 as well as on a7. So that is a very powerful threat. And typically, you should avoid that if you're black at all costs. Now let's see what happens if black tries to prevent the second rook getting to c7. Black can try to play knight to a6, so now the knight controls the c7 square, and obviously it wouldn't be a good idea for white to still go there. Now, what white should do is chase that knight away to still try to accomplish that very same goal. Now, black has not many choices. The knight is hanging on a6. If the knight goes back to where it came from, to b8, obviously white will be ready to achieve the goal and get a second rook to the 7th rank, which is extremely powerful because the rook will pick up a couple of the pawns real soon on the 7th rank. Let's go back to the very beginning and see what happens if after rook b7 and knight a6, rook c6, when we attack the knight on a6, black ignores that attack and counterattacks. And that's an interesting move to play rook e to b8. If at this stage white captures the knight on a6, the black rook will capture our rook on b7 and black will be the one who comes out ahead, as the rook is a more valuable piece than the knight. However, white is still doing excellent. Moving the rook on the 7th rank is certainly a very logical move, especially in view of the fact that if now the black knight moves away, then again we achieve our goal in doubling up our rooks on the 7th rank. Just to give you an idea how dangerous this gets, it's a lot more than just about those pawns on the 7th rank. After, for example, knight a2, white captures the pawn with a check, king moves out, we capture a second pawn on h7, threatening to give checkmate in the corner. Black has to go back with the king to g8 either immediately or after giving a rook check on b1, which only would delay things by one move. And then white would play rook g7, check, forcing the king to go the other way, and then a very important move, not immediately rook h8, which would lose the rook on g7, but playing knight to h4, a very critical move that now threatens to then come to g6, checking black's king, and when that king goes to the left to e8, then either rook can checkmate on the 8th rank. So let's go back one more time. We said rook b7, knight a6, rook c6, rook eb8, and we said rook d7. And now if the knight moves away indeed, then things work like clockwork, beautifully white wins. The problem is that black has an option, namely to play rook b6 and still not allowing the second white rook to enter the 7th rank. And black keeps being in the game. Therefore, in the position after rook b8, white's best choice right now is to trade rooks. Now, of course, if rook captures back, then the white rook captures the knight on a6. On the other hand, if black chooses the better knight recapture, that will allow the white rook to move to c8 and with a check. The reason why this is important, because now, even after the king moves out to f7, we are seeing that the black rook and knight are stuck. They are pinned. It means that the black knight cannot move without losing the rook in the corner. And for example, after playing king f1, bringing the king closer to the action, which we should do once we're in the endgame, black will have a very hard time in getting either of those two important pieces into the game. Anytime black would try to play a5 and then move the rook, the problem is the knight will be hanging. So black's best try is to try to move the king from f7 towards the knight on b8, try to protect it, and then try to get the rook out of the corner. Problem is that takes quite a bit of time, and the other problem is that once the king goes all the way to the queen's side, then the pawns on the king's side will be vulnerable and the rook can attack them and capture them. So therefore, in this situation, black is in major trouble because the rook on c8 is pinning the knight, black is stuck on the queen's side, and if the king walks over to the other side of the board, for example, king e2, king d7, then white will just play rook g8 and eat up some of those pawns on the king's side. Let's move on and see another example how important open files are. Here we are. In this position, we have no knights and we have only one pair of rooks. Let's see what's going on here. We have even number of pawns as well, and at the moment, neither side is occupying either of the open files. However, being white's turn, white can gain a significant advantage. And the correct move is to play rook e1. Now the rook immediately is threatening to come in to e7 with a check, and after the king moves out, capture the pawn on f7. Black is in a tough spot. For example, moving the rook to f8 to passively protect the pawn would lead to a great advantage for white, for example, by still entering to the 7th rank, and when the king moves down, then move the king up and simply walk the king towards the black pawns and capture them. Going back to the beginning again, after rook e1, another attempt black could have is to play right now rook to c8. Why? To be ready to answer a potential check with the rook by blocking it. But white can do better than that by playing rook e5, attacking the pawn on g5. If black now advances that pawn forward to g4, then the pawn on h5 will be lost. Black protected the pawn with f6, and now white continues the offense, attacking the pawn again, the f6 pawn this time with rook e6. Rook f8, and now rook e7. It's always a good idea to force the opponent's king down to the 8th rank, where it's kind of stuck, cannot move upward or backward. Now white has a pleasant choice between moving the king up and simply come closer to black's pawns and then attack them a second time with a rook if needed, or another excellent alternative would be to play rook h7 and go after black's weak pawn on h5. Let's examine another situation when again we're having equal number of pawns. One thing is immediately noticeable, that black has doubled and isolated pawns, while white has nicely connected pawns only. In this situation, you may think to immediately occupy an open file on d1 or e1, which generally is a good idea. However, in this case in particular, white can do clearly better than that. If the white rook would move to d1, black would get enough time to get the king closer to its weakest point, the pawn on f4, so then when the pawn would get attacked, the king would be on time protecting that very same pawn. Therefore, time is the essence right now, and the best way to continue is to immediately target that pawn on f4. And that's a somewhat unusual move, moving the rook from the side, attacking on f4. Now, black doesn't have any piece that could directly protect the pawn on f4. However, black can make a tricky move to counterattack and play rook d8. Now, if white would capture that pawn on f4 or the other one on a7, the black rook would come in with a check and a fork, and when the king gets out of the check, capture the pawn on b2, and black would be in perfect shape. So, after rook a4 and rook d8, which threatens to come into d2, white better makes a defensive move for a moment and play king e2. Now, this prevented the black rook from coming into d2. In the meantime, black still faces problems in protecting the pawn on f4. Black can try to give some checks with rook e8, followed by rook d8. Keep checking, but the checks run out. White would just play rook d4. Now, if the rook moves away, white wins quite easily, and white would win quite easily also if black does trade rooks, as black will get in a zugzwang position. Also, if black would exchange the rooks, black will lose the pawn endgame, as the white king is more advanced. The f4 pawn will still be lost. Let's move on and see the next example. In this situation, white is a pawn up, so that is a humongous advantage, of course, especially in an endgame. Nevertheless, white needs to be extremely careful. If white would advance the pawn right away, that would be an immediate blunder. It would allow the black rook to attack the pawn from behind without giving white an opportunity to protect that pawn or promote it without losing it. So therefore, that's not a good idea. What should white do? Well, remember I mentioned in the very beginning of the lesson that in the middle game or in the opening, you typically do not want to keep for too long your rooks behind your pawns. You're looking to have your rooks on open files. Now, this is the example I was referring to, which is an exceptional situation when you are having a passed pawn approaching to become a queen. That pawn typically is best aided with the rook being behind it. Like in this situation, white's best option is to play rook to a1. Now black has to hurry up and make sure to get a piece on the promotion square of the a pawn, which is on a8. Otherwise, the pawn will simply march down and get promoted to a queen. For example, if rook takes pawn, then the pawn advances, and on the next move, the pawn advances again and will be promoted to a queen. So therefore, after we said rook a1 on the first move, black's best option is to play rook to d8. Why? So when white continues now by playing a7, the rook is ready to come to the corner to prevent the pawn from promoting. Okay, so white achieved a lot in advancing the pawn, almost promoting it. But now we have a roadblock. We have the black rook in the corner not allowing us to get promoted. What to do next? The bad news is we cannot use our rook to, for example, move to b1 and then to b8 to chase the rook out of the corner, because then we'll simply lose the pawn on a7, and that's our most important piece at the moment. So the only other piece that can aid our progress is our king. And that's a very important concept to remember, that unlike in the beginning of the game, in the opening, or in the middle game, when we typically want to hide our kings near the corner, in the end game we actually do use our kings, hopefully effectively, in aiding the progress, and typically it is either to help one of our passed pawns to get all the way across, become a queen, or attack one of the weak pawns of the opponent, or lastly, preventing one of the opponent's pawns becoming a queen. So in this case, we want to use our king as quickly as possible, marching down near our pawn, and then to chase the rook out of the corner. If black tries to go there as well with the king, black will be just a bit too late. King d4, king e7, king c5, king d7, and king b6. The king arrived. White is about to play king b7, chasing the rook out of the corner and then promoting the pawn. If black tries to prevent that by playing king c8, white will just chase the king away. Now the king has no choice but move away from the b7 square, and mission accomplished. The king is on b7, the rook is attacked. Once the rook moves away, the pawn promotes. Rook takes the new queen. For example, rook h8, pawn promotes, takes, king takes, and as we can see right now, white is up an entire rook. And that's of course an easily winning endgame. Let's examine yet another typical situation for rook endgames. Here we are. In this position, we have equal number of pawns and 4 rooks on the board. The big difference is that white is the one who is pressuring the black c6 pawn, while black does not have a target at the moment. In rook endgames, a pawn makes a world of a difference. If white would succeed to win pretty much any of the black pawns, or specifically the c6 pawn, it would on a higher level guarantee a win. When you play a game of chess, don't necessarily try to think on how am I going to win? How am I going to checkmate my opponent? Try to create yourself short-term, achievable goals. Like in this situation, the next goal is to undermine black's weakness, the c6 pawn, to attack it another time or two, win it, and then once we won a pawn, then we'll deal with the next goal in how to maybe promote one of our pawns or other issues. But let's create micro plans instead of one major plan that, well, how am I going to checkmate, right? That's not going to work. So in this case, what white needs to do is, white needs to double up the rooks. And what that means is that you put your rooks on the same file. And in this case, that is the C file. The best move right now is rook to c5. And now black can choose from a large number of moves. But ultimately, none of them will be sufficient to maintain that c6 pawn. For example, if black would be running with the king to try to come closer to protect it, it will be just one move too short, as white would double up and then on the following move be ready to capture that c6 pawn. Let's talk about some other options that black has. How about if black tries to prepare and doubles up his own rooks in protecting the pawn? Looks like success. Black successfully is hanging on to that pawn on c6. And this leads to a new type of problem that the defensive side can face in similar situations. And that is that now the c6 pawn is pinned and white can successfully play d5, attacking the pawn a third time, and black is unable to capture now white's pawn on d5 without losing the rook on c7. That would be a bad choice for black. But nevertheless, there's nothing black can do in saving the pawn on c6. If after the first move, rook c5, black tries a different method of defense with rook b8, following rook c1 with rook b6, black will have a similar problem that white can still use the pin by playing d5 and then winning the pawn on c6. And here is our final example in this lesson. Here we go. For a change, it is black's turn. And again, we have all four rooks on the board and even number of pawns. At first it seems that white is in an excellent shape, already attacking black's pawn on a6. But this example will show you that even in the endgames, even when there are not that many pieces left on the board, the danger to the king is always the most important thing to keep in mind. In this case, black can create ideas of checkmate together with the two rooks and in some certain variations with the help of the h4 pawn. This is one of those rare situations in chess where it doesn't matter the order of moves. You may want to give the check with your rook on the d file first or the c file. It doesn't particularly matter because both rooks will end up on the second rank. Let's see the variation after rook goes to c2. Now, if the white king goes to h3, the end will come soon. Black will play rook d2, threatening to capture the pawn and checkmate. And if the rook protects, black has a pleasant choice in capturing the pawn immediately, or perhaps even better, playing rook f2, threatening to capture the pawn on f3 with checkmate. And when that pawn gets protected, we can still capture the pawn on a2 or alternatively make a waiting move, putting white in Zugzwang if black prefers to avoid the exchange of the rooks, which I think is a good idea here, because black's rooks are very active and forcing into passivity the white rook on h1. So now the white rook from h1 cannot move, because then black would checkmate with rook h2. The a3 rook cannot move upward because then the f3 pawn would be hanging. So the white rook must move somewhere on the third rank, and in that case black will be ready to capture the pawn on a2 and then simply march down with the a pawn. And finally, if the white king after that first check moves in the other direction down to g1, then it's not bad to bring the rook down to d2, but it's even more accurate to first play h3. A key move, you'll see in a minute why. Rook takes, rook comes down to d2, and we'll see a similar pattern that we saw in the first position we saw in this lesson. For example, rook a1, check, king h1, check, check, king f1, and rook h1. And now we see why that pawn on h3 is so important, protecting the other rook, and therefore this is checkmate. Well, I hope you understand rook endgames a bit better after this lesson, how important occupying open files are, and how important and powerful two rooks being on the 7th ranks are. Hope that you'll be able to use these ideas in your own games. Try, test it out. Thanks for listening. So long until next week.